When President Carter, as you mentioned, Mark, is buried at his home in Plains, he will be reunited with his wife, Rosalynn. She was a friend and neighbor of the Carter family as a child. After their first date, Jimmy Carter told his mother, "She's the girl I want to marry." That marriage lasted 77 years. Got a lot of people that don't even live to be that old. The two were the longest married presidential couple in the United States history. Rosalynn passed away in November of 2023 at the age of 96. And, you know, when I think about what he represents, again, for people who are just sort of being introduced to him, to hear about him as a man and as a family man, but also, again, what he did after his life. But that says something, you know, 77 years, there's no getting around that. That's a big deal.
And the town of Americus is where they shared a lot of joys, because in Americus is where Habitat for Humanity was headquartered.
Mm-hmm.
It was Reverend Millard Fuller, very eccentric kind of character, who created up the idea of Habitat. And instead of the big public housing in urban areas that were being built in Chicago and New York and elsewhere in the 70s, Habitat did smaller homes. So they would regularly be in Americas for the Habitat offices and board meetings. Secondarily, Rosalynn Carter, her long shadow, like the Carter Center in Atlanta is for Jimmy Carter, hers is there in Americus at Georgia Southwestern, where her Institute for Mental Health is there. And when she took on the issue of mental health, it was stigmatized. Mm-hmm. And she did more than anybody to talk about that, shed light that you should not be embarrassed about it. And you see throughout their lives, both Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter finding a lot of healthy, good times trying to help people that had mental illness and people that were in jail and that they thought should not be incarcerated.
Mm-hmm. And Doug, picking up on that point, I want to go back to Robert Costa, who is with us in Washington. Robert, it was enormously important for all of Jimmy Carter's political career to have Rosalynn at his side, and was visible in the White House and was not only a fierce internal advocate for him, but an external one as well.
And Mrs. Carter did not love the idea of coming back, at least initially, to Plains.
Not at all.
She really enjoyed that life of being a spouse in the United States Navy, traveling the world and traveling the country with then Officer Jimmy Carter. But after Carter's father passed away, he wanted to return to the family's peanut warehouse and the peanut business, the shelling business down in Plains, and she came with him. And when you talk to Carter allies, like I spent a lot of time this week with 90-year-old Jerry Rafshoon, who was one of Carter's key political advisors, that she was there at his side in 1966 when he ran and lost a race for governor against a segregationist, but he came back encouraged by Mrs. Carter, encouraged by others to seek the governorship in 1970, and he won that race. And he famously declared in January of 1971 in his inaugural address, "The time for racial discrimination in Georgia is over." And this set off so much attention on Carter across the country. Reporters started traveling down to Plains and to Atlanta to meet this new governor who was different, represented perhaps a new South, moving away from the segregationist past. And a lot of that comes back to Plains. Mm-hmm. Carter's own mother, Miss Lillian, she was someone who had a different view on race than a lot of people in the South at a time of racism and segregation. Carter grew up with black people as part of his family community in a way that a lot of people in the South did not at the time.
Yeah, and Rosalynn, as we see pictures of the two of them, clearly supported her husband in that way and gave so much of herself as someone who was attached to a president, a governor, a state senator. I want to turn back to Mark Strassmann, because I know he's got an interesting story to talk about in reference to the rocking chair and Miss Rosalynn Carter. Tell us about that, Mark.
Yeah, if you go to Jimmy Carter's office at the Carter Presidential Center, there's a handmade wooden two-seat rocking chair. And this is where Mrs. Carter would sit during meetings that she was part of. And Jason Carter, the Carter's grandson, also told me he could not count the number of times that he walked into that office to find Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter, his grandparents, sitting in that rocking chair side by side, just chatting. And as another illustration of just how, even when they weren't together, they were never far out of mind, In Jimmy Carter's office, if you sat in the chair and looked straight across the office, there's a portrait of Rosalynn Carter on the far wall. If you go into Rosalynn Carter's office and sit in her chair, there's a portrait of Jimmy Carter on the far wall. So 77 years, constant companions, surely mutually inspiring to each other. And as Jason Carter said, one of the things that he celebrates most about his grandparents is that they had a true love story.
Mm-hmm.